LinkedIn presents.
The first time journalist Ben Wallace heard the word Bitcoin was in the summer of 2011.
I got a call from an editor at Wired magazine, which I had written for one time.
The editor was looking for someone to write about this newfangled digital currency.
But I was an unlikely person to call in that I was kind of a Luddite former English major, not a computer guy, didn't know how to code. But it immediately got my attention.
Because it was totally new, a new kind of money. That doesn't come along every day. The British pound is 1,200 years old, the dollar 230. And Bitcoin wasn't just new, it was different. Unlike the pound or the dollar, it wasn't issued by a central bank. Instead, Bitcoin relied on a network of volunteer computers spread all over the world. Together, these computers maintained a public ledger, also known as the blockchain, to track every transaction. Put another way, Bitcoin was independent and decentralized. It was punk, countercultural, anarchist, libertarian. It was unregulated and untested, risky and alluring. And there was something else that got Ben's attention.
This invention that was already beginning to get some traction had an inventor and no one knew who it was other than this pseudonym.
Satoshi Nakamoto. 2.5 years earlier, on Halloween 2008, as children donned costumes, Satoshi performed his own masquerade, appearing out of nowhere on an obscure cryptography email list to outline his idea for Bitcoin.
And no one had ever heard of this person. It wasn't a group regular. This was their very first post.
And it was met with a collective shrug. These cryptographers have been trying to create digital cash for decades. And now this rando, who was clearly hiding behind a pseudonym because searches for his name returned nothing, now he was claiming to have cracked it.
Most of the initial reactions are kind of to try to shoot holes in it and are fairly pessimistic and not that impressed.
But then, in January 2009, Satoshi released the Bitcoin software. And those skeptics realized he'd pulled off what they'd long thought was impossible. Over the next few years, these once dubious cryptographers, and by the way, if you're wondering, cryptography is the science of creating and analyzing secret codes. These once dubious cryptographers became Bitcoin's biggest believers. And Satoshi was right there beside them. He was refining the source code. He was printing, or mining in the lingo of crypto, new Bitcoin. This is an elaborate process where computers race to solve complicated math puzzles, and whoever gets it right first earns new Bitcoins as a reward. So long story short, he's there. But then, in the spring of 2011, shortly before Ben got that call from Wired, Satoshi stopped posting, stopped responding to emails. As mysteriously as he'd appeared, he vanished, taking with him Bitcoins that today are worth $100 billion. I'm Caleb Bissinger, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, a 15-year quest to unmask the secret genius behind crypto. Little did Ben Wallace know when he said yes to that assignment from the editor at Wired that he was accepting a mission that would consume years of his life. He'd end up quitting his job, learning to code, traveling the world, worrying his wife, all in a fervent attempt to find Bitcoin's inventor. What intrigued Ben, as he writes in his new book, The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto, wasn't so much the riddle of Satoshi's identity, as it was the shocker that that riddle had endured. In a world, he says, where the internet shone pervasive light into every corner, there were vanishingly few unanswered questions of this kind. We'd learned who Bob Woodward's secret source was. We finally knew the proof of Fermat's last theorem. For Ben, the mystery of Satoshi is, to borrow a phrase from Arthur Conan Doyle, the final problem. how he tried to solve that problem right after this.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, host of Everyday Better, an award-winning podcast dedicated to personal development. Join me every week for captivating stories and research to find more fulfillment in your work and personal life. Listen to Everyday Better on the LinkedIn Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Ben Wallace, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thrilled to be here.
So before we get into the mystery of Satoshi, I was thinking as I was preparing for this conversation that I have like a whole encyclopedia of things that I pretend to understand at dinner parties, but that in fact I do not understand at all. And Bitcoin is definitely on that list. So help me out. Give me like a layman's terms definition. What is Bitcoin?
I actually, while I was working on this book, I went to a dinner party and someone said, "What is Bitcoin?" And it's not that simple to explain. But I will try anyway. So Bitcoin is, first of all, digital money, right? So if you think of a bank, has a database that keeps a record of how much money you have in the bank, even though because of fractional reserve banking, they don't actually hold all of that money in the bank, but they have a record that they maintain. They're insured by federal deposit insurance. And this record says so-and-so owns this amount of money. Oh, and they just sent this money to this other person. Okay. And they keep the record, the bank, backed up by the government. Okay. Bitcoin does away with the bank, does away with the government, but it maintains its own record, its own ledger. And the ledger, instead of being maintained by a bank, is maintained by a crowd, by a peer-to-peer network of computers that anyone can join and sort of take part in this process. And so it's kind of a crowd-managed money.
And talk a little bit about the motive behind creating Bitcoin. Before we sort of get into who the potential creators could be or creator, talk a little bit about the motive. Like, was this just an intellectual exercise? What's the problem they were trying to solve? What's the community of thought from which this emerges?
So it's not 100% certain what the motives were because Satoshi Nakamoto never said, "This is why I did it."
Mm-hmm.
But Satoshi Nakamoto did provide some clues. The very first block of the blockchain, which is the name of this ledger that underlies the currency, contained a headline from the Times of London that read, "Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." So this is during the financial crisis, right?
Right.
So there's some suggestion that Satoshi came from a perhaps libertarian perspective, objected to central bank meddling in monetary supply. That's a big clue. The early adopters tended to be libertarian-minded people who wanted a money independent of banks and governments and who also kind of objected to the kind of hyperinflation that can be created by money printing by governments.
Just to pause you there, part of the design of Bitcoin is that there is a hard cap on the number of Bitcoin that can be printed or mined. You can't just keep infinitely producing more Bitcoins, right? So it's deflationary.
Exactly. It's hard-coded as a 21 million coin cap, which I think will be achieved in 2142.
Okay, so sorry, as you were you're digging into this this libertarian
Right.
kind of quasi-anarchist early adopter community.
Right. And there were also two precedents that led people early on to focus on a couple of groups as potentially where Satoshi had come from. And one of those was a group called the cypherpunks, which had emerged in the 1990s. They were basically cryptography-interested people who thought that cryptography could solve a lot of problems on the, at that time, nascent internet. And they spoke a lot about digital money. So they were one of the sets of people who people thought Satoshi might have been among. And the other group, which was adjacent to the cypherpunks, were called the extropians. And they were also kind of Silicon Valley-ish, but their main focus was not cryptography, but life extension. They were focused on things like cryonics, the idea of being frozen when you die and the possibility of being reanimated later. And one of the ideas that had been floated by some extropians was that if you were going to potentially be on ice for decades or even centuries, how would you be able to send your wealth into the future?
This is all totally fascinating to me. I don't know. Like I said, I came into this book pathetically underinformed about Bitcoin and had just sort of assumed that the origin story was one of, we live in a world in which anything that can be digitized will be digitized. And so, oh, cool, money, let's make that digital. But this whole potential political philosophy behind it, that was completely new terrain to me.
The other thing I should mention is that there was a reason why this didn't exist before. I mean, there's something called the double spending problem, right? So the internet, right, is a Xerox machine. It's instantaneous, worldwide distribution of information, but no one had managed to figure out a way to do that for value, to create digital scarcity. And so there was a computer science accomplishment at the core of what Bitcoin was, and that was to solve the double spending problem through a set of complex protocols that we don't need to go down into.
Yeah, proof of work. If anyone wants to Google proof of work and all these
Exactly.
kinds of things, there's lots of bros explaining it on YouTube for you. Okay, so we've kind of established what Bitcoin is. It's this peer-to-peer digital currency. It potentially emerges out of this sort of libertarian mindset. It's borderless, it's unregulated. So that's kind of what Bitcoin is. Let's talk about who is behind it. And so this is the mysterious Mr. Satoshi Nakamoto, the subject of your book. What do we know? What are the sort of basic facts that we think we know about this creator?
So the early facts about Satoshi, or believed facts about Satoshi, were that he seemed to be Japanese. He had a profile on a peer-to-peer foundation social media site that gave his birth date as 1975. But from there, it starts getting interpretive. Like, some people thought he was a genius coder. Some people said the coding itself is not that advanced. Some people thought he was a genius cryptographer. Other people said he's using really rudimentary cryptography. And part of the problem of Satoshi for journalists covering it is that it very quickly gets into the weeds on the technology. And so, if you have even cryptographers who can't agree on how good a cryptographer Satoshi is or how good a coder he is, you can understand how complicated that becomes for anyone who's not in those fields.
And people are picking apart even things like his word choice, his spelling.
Yeah, I mean, people started immediately. I shouldn't say immediately, because for the first couple of years, it was this open source software project that might be going nowhere. But by 2011, when it was starting to get some traction, it had become the currency of Silk Road, which was this new black marketplace on the dark web, the first of its kind. And by then, Satoshi had disappeared. That's the thing. So Satoshi worked with the other programmers on the open source project, again, all by email. So no one ever met him, saw him, talked to him. But for the first 2 years, Satoshi worked with other programmers. Then he sends some emails in April 2011 to a few of them, and that's the last time he's heard from. So by a few months later, by the summer of 2011, people are beginning to really look into, like, who is Satoshi anyway? Who was this guy? And they're looking at, like, oh, he used two spaces after periods in his writing. Oh, he used Commonwealth spelling sometimes, but not consistently. So spelling color with OU instead of just O, that sort of thing. And there was a guy, Stephen Thomas in Switzerland, who had analyzed the timestamps of all of Satoshi's posts to the Bitcoin forum and, done a timestamp analysis to try to come up with what time zone he might be in. And that was the level of minutia people were looking at.
And so take us to 2011 when you mentioned this is when you first become aware of Bitcoin. And this is a ripe moment in the story. So Satoshi has announced this idea in October 2008. He's active for a few years. He's emailing people. He's on message boards. He's mysterious, but he's there. And then, April 2011, poof, he disappears. And so good journalists that you are you like, oh my God, this is a really great mystery?
100%. And I thought it would yield to typical, sort of normal journalistic techniques. Like, usually in these situations, it's like you talk to enough people, you're going to find someone who knows something, and you'll be able to piece it together. And this mystery did not work that way.
Part of what I think is so exciting about this mystery and why so many people are attracted to it is that not only are there so few breadcrumbs left behind by Satoshi and so much debate about which breadcrumbs are red herrings and which should we trust and which should we distrust, and as you say, disagreement about, oh, he was a great coder, oh, he was a shitty coder. But when he disappeared, 1 million Bitcoin disappeared with him. This is coin that he had minted and that he owned. And that today is worth like $100 billion. So he disappeared with this gigantic fortune, none of which he has ever spent. And to me, that just completely defies human instinct, right? If I had invented a world-shattering technology, I'd have a super hard time not shouting about it from the rooftops. And yet here's a guy or a person or a group of people who managed to stay completely anonymous. And if I had access to $100 billion, my gosh, I'd have a hard time not spending it. It defies human behavior, I think. And that's why it's just so alluring. Does that track for you?
Absolutely. I mean, I think of the Satoshi mystery as having three parts. One is, why use a pseudonym? Like, why not get the credit for this incredible thing? Or if you use one initially, why not eventually come out from behind it? Two is, why disappear? Why not stay involved with this thing that's becoming more and more mainstream and is now a worldwide phenomenon that nation states have to deal with? And the third is, why not touch the money?
Let's talk about the simple explanations here, right? So I think the simplest explanation is that, why did Satoshi disappear? He died. Would we say that's a simple explanation for his dropping off the face of the earth?
It's one of them, but he probably only disappeared for good in 2014. Because there was one further Satoshi message posted from the same email account that year. But even if even if someone else had gained control of the email account and it wasn't Satoshi, I mean, Satoshi said, I've moved on to other things in one of his last communications. So it wasn't that he suddenly died. I mean, was he about to die and he knew it? Perhaps. That is a possibility. I mean, another one, though, is that and this is sad but very possible, is he might have lost the keys to the coins.
And explain how that works, right? This is a really interesting piece of how Bitcoin operates, this idea of self-sovereignty. Give listeners who don't really understand that aspect a little bit of a guide here.
There's a saying in cryptocurrency, not your keys, not your coins, that basically it's an ethos of, because this is not a currency that depends on banks and governments, you control your own coins. You have the keys, and the keys are really passwords. And just as you could lose your password for anything, you can lose your password for your Bitcoin. The difference is you have no recourse. If you lose your password, you lost your password.
Yeah.
There's no one's going to do a reset of your account after you show them your driver's license.
So, okay, seems unlikely that Satoshi just died. That doesn't seem like a good explanation. Possible the reason he hasn't touched the money is he's lost his keys. Let's talk about some of the more complex theories about who Satoshi could be and why he disappeared. And I sort of group these into three categories. The first category of potential Satoshi is that Bitcoin was created not by a person under the guise of Satoshi Nakamoto, but by the intelligence community. Some people believe that the NSA, the CIA, maybe an international actor, is the force behind Bitcoin.
Yes.
Second is this individual genius theory, right? That there is a Satoshi Nakamoto. There is someone behind that pseudonym. They are very clever. They created this incredible technology and then, for reasons that we don't yet fully understand, dropped off the face of the earth. And the third is that Satoshi Nakamoto is actually an alias for a group of people, that Bitcoin was a team effort, and to cover their tracks, they hid themselves behind one pseudonym, behind one alias. Let's start with the intelligence community theory. What do you think? Could the NSA or the CIA or MI6 be behind Bitcoin?
I mean, the first question is, why would they have done this, right? So the two arguments for why they might have done this are, they created a network as sort of a honeypot, right? As sort of the idea was it was going to be this anonymous or quasi-anonymous currency system that would attract criminals, but which actually isn't anonymous really, because the blockchain is transparent. It's a visible ledger. And the idea was that it was this kind of long game system that criminals would start using who could then be monitored. And not just criminals, also rogue nation states.
Right.
Another theory was that it would be a way for an intelligence agency to move money around in a relatively untraceable way to, for instance, assets in the field in some remote, authoritarian country where you can't just send a bank wire.
So there's a certain amount of logic there, right? I mean, that does sound like something that the CIA would have an interest in doing. And it certainly sounds like if you're at Langley and you're thinking, wow, digital currency is really going to become a thing of the future and it's going to absolutely be empowering to criminals in the black market. And wow, if we trick them all into creating it and we have full visibility into who's using it, that's incredibly powerful for them.
And we know that the NSA had actually done an internal study on digital money that later became public. So it's absolutely something that was on their radar.
And there's other precedents here, right? I mean, you write in the book about other examples of, either the Naval Research Laboratory or the CIA creating software, creating technology that is actually used for nefarious means.
I mean, recently we have the case of the Anam phones that the FBI set up, and they something like 600 criminals were arrested worldwide because they started using this supposedly safe encrypted phone system that had been created by the FBI.
But you're not a big believer, I don't think, in the intelligence service theory. Tell me why it doesn't hold water for you.
I actually have come around to thinking it's very much a possibility.
Oh, interesting.
One of the reasons is that old Sherlock Holmes quote that I'm going to get wrong, but basically, if all of the sort of more obvious theories aren't true, whatever's left, however improbable, must be true. And so once you start eliminating a lot of the other possibilities, the NSA or CIA theory becomes more plausible.
Let's talk about the predominant theory of the case, which is that there is a real person behind the guise of Satoshi Nakamoto. This is the most common view out there, right?
The individual or the team is the most common view. What I think we can say for sure is that the person who interacted with the community in the message boards, in the emails, is almost certainly one person because the voice is just too cohesive and too consistent. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't be a team because, one person could have coded it. One person could have conceptualized it. One person could have been the point person for dealing with the open source community. But the main theory, because it does seem to be a single voice and a single coherent idea from the beginning, is that it is a lone genius. Mm-hmm. That would also be supported by the fact that the mystery has gone on for so long, right? I mean, loose slips sink ships. Like the more people who are involved, and this is why I thought it would yield to reporting, because the minute you get two people involved, at some point they're going to have a rift, or one of them's going to tell a spouse, or one of them's going to get drunk and say something they shouldn't. I mean, it's just very hard for secrets to stay secret. And so that's one of the main arguments for why it's probably an individual.
Yeah, right. You mentioned a few times the Ben Franklin quote, two can keep a secret if one of them is dead.
Exactly.
And so, okay, so walk through the investigative method then for this lone genius theory, though. Like, what are you doing? You're taking breadcrumbs, you're looking at word choice, you're analyzing coding language, you're trying to figure out matching that to real people who maybe have the means, the motive, the opportunity. Is that kind of how it's working?
Yeah, I mean, there were sort of waves of this. Like the very first wave was like, oh, it's probably one of these 5 people. Like there were 5 people or 4 people whose names kept coming up, and every reporter thought, oh, it's going to be one of these people. And no one could really prove that it was one of these people. Then over the years, people started using stylometry, right? So a statistical analysis of prose, comparing Nakamoto's prose with various candidates' prose.
And let me just pause. Like the way that works, that was a really fascinating thing in this book. Like you're basically saying, how often are they using the word but? And you're comparing, an obscure term that maybe Satoshi used in the white paper or, in a post. And wow, has anyone else online ever used this unusual word, And so, right. So that's kind of how stylometry is working. Right. Okay.
But one of the interesting revelations for me about stylometry is that so there's sort of the amateur stylometry where you're like, oh, this person uses that weird word and that person uses this weird word. But the way stylometrists are often working is not focusing on the weird words. They're focusing on the everyday words like of and they call them function words, but which amazingly, at a sort of unconscious level, like everyone's got a stylistic fingerprint, even with those words. And when it's analyzed sort of at the, machine speed and scale, they can find patterns that can make it, statistically very probable that this person is the same person who wrote that other thing.
And part of what's interesting there, too, is that's harder to fake.
Exactly.
It's easy, I think, to go through and say, oh, I'm going to change all of my spellings to be British to throw people off the scent.
Yeah.
Or, oh, here's a weird word that I would never, ever use, but I'm going to use it a few times just to conceal myself. But the way that we use, these functional words is so subconscious that it's very hard for us to consciously say, oh, I'm going to use, but a lot more.
Exactly. So there was a wave of stylometry approaches, but generally applied to a very limited set of people, of these usual suspects.
And these usual suspects, sorry to interrupt you, but these are people, they're usual suspects because they've been active in some of the same online groups. They've also written about digital currency. They seem to maybe share some of the political libertarian mindset. They're sort of in the Satoshi orbit, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So I thought I wanted to take a few approaches that hadn't been taken because, again, a lot of people have looked at this, and I still thought there were some things that people had not done that perhaps would yield some different answers. And one of those things was applying stylometry to a much larger group of people, not just to people who seemed like they'd be logical Satoshi candidates, but actually to like everyone who participated on these mailing lists. I also thought since 2015, when a research paper came out, there's been a version of stylometry that has existed for code, not just for prose. And it does the same thing to code and is, again, like remarkably accurate in finding similarities. And so this was, obviously beyond my abilities, but I hired somebody to do that. The other thing that I did, which I thought would be helpful, was to become more fluent in the technical vernacular of this conversation. Because again, when I started out, I thought there was this sort of insider-outsider problem where the insiders all talk to each other at a very technical level, and a lot of them aren't that interested in the mystery. And then all the outsiders don't speak in the technical vernacular, and they are interested in the mystery, but it's very hard to analyze it unless you get into the technical weeds. And so I, took some courses, got a tutor, read a lot of books, created some programs, and learned to code to the extent that a Luddite former English major can do.
When you expand your candidate pool beyond these usual suspects, as you say, some interesting potential Satoshis emerge. So one that you write about in the book, this is news to me that this theory is out there, is that Elon Musk could potentially be Satoshi. Walk me through that argument.
Well, so one of the actually triggers for me to really dive back into this was in late 2021, I got an email unsolicited from someone saying Elon Musk is Satoshi. They didn't say who they were, but I started Googling and found that there was a guy who had posted this Elon Musk theory maybe on Medium. He was someone who'd previously been an engineer at Tesla. And there were a few arguments for Elon. One was, this is clearly an extremely capable, polymathic person. He's already created SpaceX. He's willed an e-car industry into existence. In his spare time, he tossed off an idea for a transportation system called the Hyperloop. His company was bought by PayPal. Like, he has a longstanding interest in internet money. And then there were the more micro things like 2 spaces after a period. He can code in the language C++, which Bitcoin was coded in.
He's South African, which that's a former Commonwealth.
Exactly. So that would make sense. I also think that a third theory that is valid for why Satoshi might not have touched the money is, what if it's someone who is already extremely wealthy? So they don't need it as much. And so Elon could, arguably fit that. I spoke to Sahil Gupta, whose theory it was eventually. I found the theory weak. I mean, it's actually not that strong when you dig down into it. But that is the problem with this mystery, is it's very easy to hear 20 coincidences and be convinced, oh, of course, it must be this person. That makes so much sense. And you realize there's like 20 coincidences for hundreds of people.
Yeah, right. And everyone has one kind of alibi or one disqualifying factor, or sometimes more than one. But it's like, oh, this lines up and that lines up and this lines up. But, oh, they were running in a 10K at the exact time that we know Satoshi sent a particular email.
Exactly.
Every good candidate seems to have a flaw that disqualifies them.
Well, and then you get into this maddening rabbit hole of what if Satoshi wasn't sincere? What if some of the things we think are clues were deliberate misdirections?
Mm-hmm.
What if Satoshi is not from a Commonwealth country and deliberately injected those into his prose to throw people off? And then it's just crazy making because you don't even have solid, of the clues you have, they might not even be real clues.
Right. So, okay, staying for one more beat in this lone genius camp, if you had to point your finger at one lone genius who you think there's the strongest case to be made that this person is Satoshi, who would that person be?
It would be one of two people. It would be either...
The answer when we come back.
Hi, I'm Adam Grant, host of the podcast Rethinking, a show where I talk to some of today's greatest thinkers about the unconventional ways they see the world. On Rethinking, you'll get surprising insights from scientists, leaders, artists, and more. People like Reese Witherspoon, Malcolm Gladwell, and Yo-Yo Ma. Hear lessons to help you find success at work, build better relationships, and more. Find Rethinking wherever you get your podcasts.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. In my 20s, I knew what career success looked like. In midlife, it's not that simple. Work is changing, we're changing, and there's no guidebook for how to make sense of it. So come figure it out with me on the Hello Monday podcast. I've been a journalist for 2 decades, writing cover stories for Business Week, Fortune, and Wired. And now, every Monday, I bring you conversations with people who are thinking deeply about work and where it fits into our lives. Like Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella on growth mindsets.
The learn-it-all does better than the know-it-all.
Or NYU professor Scott Galloway on choosing a career.
I think the worst advice you can give a kid is follow your passion.
Or MacArthur Genius winner Angela Duckworth on talent versus grit.
Your long-term effort and your long-term commitment are surprisingly important.
Each episode delivers pragmatic advice for right now. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Right before the break, I asked Ben, if you could point your finger at one lone genius who you think might have created Bitcoin, who would it be?
It would be one of two people. It would be either Nick Szabo or Hal Finney. Nick Szabo and Hal Finney were both cypherpunks, and for that matter, they were both extropians. Both of them had come up with digital cash systems before. Nick Szabo had written about an idea called Bitcold that had a lot of parallels to what Bitcoin was.
Mm-hmm.
Hal Finney had created the first implementation of Bitcold, and Hal Finney was also the very first person other than Nakamoto to run a computer in the network. Like he was the second node in the Bitcoin network. He had more computer chops than Szabo did. Like Szabo had studied computer science, but he wasn't a,
wasn't a hardcore coder.
He wasn't a hardcore programmer, hardcore cryptography guy like Hal Finney was.
And I think Szabo didn't seem to be well-versed in the particular language that Satoshi used for coding. But again, as we're saying, everyone kind of has a lot of pieces that line up, but a few that don't. And one with Hal Finney is that he was diagnosed with ALS. And it's sort of hard to reckon with this idea that someone who's battling a very expensive, debilitating disease that's putting incredible stress on their family would refrain from touching that billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin, or would refrain from setting up research institutes to further the study of ALS, right? So that seems to be a piece of the Hal profile that doesn't fit, right?
I think so, although, again, unless he lost his keys, which is not out of the question. I mean, I talked to some very experienced cryptographers who say it happens, like I've done it, so that's not impossible. But then there's also the thing you mentioned about the I think it was either a half marathon or a 10K or something, that Hal Finney is documented as running at a moment when Nakamoto sent a communication to another programmer.
Yeah. Though, didn't I read in your book that Nakamoto was using email applications that allow you to manipulate the time and basically, like, we have scheduled send now with Gmail, right?
Exactly,
like,
yeah.
Isn't there a world in which Nakamoto could have said, I'm Hal Finney, I'm going to schedule this email to be sent at this moment when I'm physically elsewhere to, again, throw people off the scent?
100%. I think that's a very real possibility. So I don't consider that disqualifying evidence.
And we should note that I think all three of these candidates we've discussed so far, Elon Musk, Szabo, Hal Finney, they were all vocal in denying, have all been on the record of denying that they are Satoshi Nakamoto. Now, we can talk a little bit maybe about how much weight one can put into a vocal denial of being an anonymous person. But we should say for the record that they've all been asked and they've all said, definitely not me, right?
Right. I do think a denial is meaningless. There's so many cases of people in these analogous situations who deny it, including Mark Felt, who turned out to be Deep Throat. He denied it repeatedly, including the journalist Joe Klein, who wrote a book, sort of a Romana Clay about Bill Clinton in the 90s under the name Anonymous, and he denied it repeatedly, including to his journalism colleagues, and he turned out to have been lying. It was him. Bob Woodward, whose source Deep Throat was confronted by another person at the Washington Post who thought it was Felt, and Woodward lied about it. So these denials are just meaningless. And a lot of people who've been asked this question, are you Satoshi, will often answer no, but if I was, would I tell you? So it's kind of a useless no.
So I'm such a noob when it comes to Bitcoin. I'm such an outsider. My understanding of this, as I've mentioned, is very limited. But here's my gut on why I don't buy the individual genius. You point out in the book that Satoshi would need like near superhuman expertise in a bunch of different domains, right? He would have to be a really good coder. He'd have to understand deep math. He'd have to understand accounting, privacy, security, law. Even someone as polymathish as Elon Musk, it's hard for me to accept that one dude could have that much expertise in such varied domains. What do you think? Does that check out? Am I onto something?
I think it's a fair theory, but, at this point, I think anything is possible. So, yes, that makes sense to me, but things happen all the time that are extremely improbable and unlikely. And one of those could be there happened to be this one guy who was a genius in like several different areas, and those came together in this one brilliant stroke of insight he had.
And of course, there's historical precedence for this, right? I mean, for centuries, a debate has raged about Shakespeare couldn't possibly have been one person, right? There's no way that this man who was not to the manner born, who didn't have an extensive education, could have written so beautifully, could have had such command of history, could have had such command of other cultures and Latin. And yet, I think the resounding theory is that, no, Shakespeare was one person, that like this was not a team effort.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's talk about the group theory. This, as you say, is kind of the other predominant theory out there, that either Satoshi is the lone genius or it's a group of brilliant actors working together. So make the case for why many people believe that there's a group behind Satoshi Nakamoto.
One of the reasons is what you suggest. This is just too complex and involves too many different fields of expertise to be a single person. So one of the theories, the group theories, is that the idea and white paper were one person, the communications with the community were a second person, the code was a third person. The group theory is tempting because then you can say, well, this person brought X to it, that person. It gives you a lot more to work with in terms of assembling the whole Satoshi, if you can take a piece from there and a piece from there.
Right. But as you alluded to before, the fatal flaw potentially in the group theory is that, and I'm quoting you here, it's very hard to believe that a cabal in possession not only of the biggest secret in technology, but also of the keys to a monstrously huge fortune, had defied incomprehensible odds and agreed, mum's the word. I read that as you sort of throwing water on, that's the biggest weak point in the group theory.
It is. I mean, I'm super skeptical of conspiracies. They're just so hard to do and so hard to keep secret. And one example I give in the book, a counterexample, is COINTELPRO, right? This group that broke into FBI offices and kept it secret for, I think, 20 years. So it does happen. It's not impossible. Another example is if you are behind the wall of an intelligence agency, obviously there are people at the NSA every day doing things we don't know about. Sure. So they keep secrets. And that's another argument for an intelligence agency.
There's a word that you use throughout the book as you're describing your quest. Let me see if I can pronounce this right. Apophenia. Define that for me.
Apophenia is the human tendency to see patterns, right? To recognize patterns, to find meaning in things, but also meaning that isn't necessarily there. And an example that someone I spoke to gave me was you look at these stars and you see Orion, but if you were on another planet, you wouldn't see Orion. So we connect these dots into constellations of meaning. I went into this understanding that coincidences aren't enough. And I felt like sort of the approach of if you can stack up enough coincidences, you found Satoshi was not going to be enough to figure out who it was.
Are you familiar with the Umbrella Man?
I'm not.
So in the Zapruder film, which is the most complete video of John F. Kennedy's assassination, it's like 30 seconds long, there's a guy standing right near the motorcade when the shots are fired, and he's holding a black umbrella. And it was a warm, sunny day in Dallas in 1963. So people started asking, wait, what is it? Why does he have an umbrella? That's very strange. And as you could guess, this triggers all sorts of conspiracy theories. And in 1967, John Updike wrote about the Umbrella Man in The New Yorker. And he said this, he wrote, quote, "We wonder whether a genuine mystery is being concealed here, or whether any similar scrutiny of a minute section of time and space would yield similar strangenesses, gaps, inconsistencies, warps and bubbles in the surface of circumstance. Perhaps, as with elements of matter, investigation passes a threshold of common sense and enters a subatomic realm where laws are mocked, where persons have the lifespan of beta particles and transparency of neutrinos, and where a rough kind of averaging out must substitute for absolute truth. The truth about those seconds in Dallas is especially elusive. The search for it seems to demonstrate how perilously empiricism verges on magic." Does that resonate for you?
100%. And I'm sort of disappointed in myself that I hadn't read that passage. I mean, that's exactly the phenomenon that I kept encountering with this. It's sort of a combination of a long-distance pattern recognition and a nearsighted pattern recognition. If you're too far away, like if you don't understand that terms like, zero-knowledge proofs are actually pretty commonplace among cryptographers, you think it's a real coincidence and a remarkable similarity that must mean something. And if you are too close to anyone, you will find enough pieces of data that you can cherry pick to assemble a theory that person is Satoshi.
Did you feel that your empiricism was verging on magic? I mean, did you have moments where you thought, in this quest to be journalistic and to be empirical, you'd somehow taken the wrong fork and ended up down a rabbit hole that was totally conspiratorial?
Yeah. I mean, there was one moment in particular when I kind of fell into the trap that bedevils anyone who goes down this rabbit hole. I found this one word, right, that this one guy had used that Satoshi Nakamoto had used, but that in all of the decades prior on any of the related message boards, the cypherpunks, the extropians, that word had appeared only one time. And I thought, it can't not be this guy. And there were other reasons to think this guy was a potential candidate. But when I found that coincidence, and when I then researched even the rarity of the word among linguists and linguistic corpuses, and it was so rare.
I think the word is unfensible, right? Or fensible.
Exactly. I think Satoshi used fensible. One of them used unfensible and the other used fensible to mean, able to be sold, as in stolen goods.
Right.
This is a word that in that sense has never appeared, in 175 years of the New York Times.
Right.
It doesn't appear in some vast linguists' corpuses, and yet it had been used by Satoshi and one time by one of the cypherpunks.
Mm-hmm.
So that just set me off on a, its own, that was its own sort of side quest.
And I want to give listeners, too, a sense of just how deep you were in this story. Like, yeah, as you're alluding to, you weren't just tracking this casually. I mean, you quit your job, you were traveling all over the world, and I think it's fair to say that you became obsessed, maybe almost unhealthily obsessed with trying to unravel this mystery. Is that an accurate characterization, or am I off base?
I think it is. I think it is. It absolutely was an obsession. My wife kind of, in a loving spousal way, would make fun of me. Anytime she'd see me, on my laptop, the fan would be whirring because the computer was doing, too much work trying to download things off the internet. And she would say, "How's the Bitcoin mining going?" I also kind of internalized some of the paranoia of the search, and I found myself, I have a paper shredder that I bought years ago for another story where there were private investigators posing as sources. I dusted off the paper shredder. I put my phone on lockdown mode. And I was absolutely like in the conspiratorial trenches on this.
A sentiment that you kept encountering in your reporting was, why does it matter who Satoshi Nakamoto was? If he wanted to disappear, just let the guy disappear, leave him alone. And here you are just doggedly trying to unmask this person who, if they are a real person, clearly doesn't want to be found. And you quote at one point this aphorism from the artist Jenny Holzer, and she says, "Anything is a legitimate area of investigation." And I think you sort of take that as your credo as you're pursuing this, that this is a legitimate area of investigation. Finding someone who doesn't want to be found is a legitimate area of investigation. Do you think that's true? Did you ever have doubts? Did you ever worry that you were, there was almost something unethical in this pursuit?
I thought about it a lot. I have a few answers to that. One is, just as a reporter, as a journalist, I mean, the thing that gets me up in the morning is like someone doesn't want me to know something and I'm trying to find out what that thing is. So that's the not high-minded answer. And I'm a very curious person, and mysteries kind of just nag at me, and I want to know what's behind the mystery. But one of the ways I thought about this is trying to find out, to my mind, does not cross into any kind of ethical territory. The question of what you do with the information once you have found it is where you get into ethical questions. And so for me, I always thought the hard decision will be what to do with the information if I find it. And I also thought that will depend on what I find.
Right.
I was prepared to not publish the name of a person if I thought I had found a person whom it would be harmful to publish their name. Let's say I found out that Satoshi was a dissident in Iran. I'm not going to sign that person's death warrant in a million years, right? On the other hand, let's say I found out that Bitcoin was invented by the Chinese Communist Party as a way to destabilize the US dollar.
Yeah.
Is that not newsworthy? And you can't even begin to make that decision until you know the answer.
Yeah.
So I actually think it's fine and perhaps necessary to try to figure out who Satoshi is.
And on that subject of knowing the answer, I mean, something you point out repeatedly in the book is that for all the people who say it doesn't matter who Satoshi is, the mystery around Satoshi has been incredibly beneficial to Bitcoin, not only in terms of creating mystique, but that there could be real consequences to this digital currency were Satoshi to be unmasked. Talk about those consequences.
So here is where I think actually the sort of hardcore ideological Bitcoiners have a point. At this point, Bitcoin is big enough that you can argue that who Satoshi is will not affect its trajectory. But an argument for why it could matter is 1.1 million coins. If Satoshi's alive, if Satoshi still controls the keys, and if Satoshi were to suddenly dump those coins on the market, it would 100% affect the price of Bitcoin. If Satoshi turned out to be a objectionable person in some way, perhaps Fidelity is no longer going to offer an Bitcoin ETF to retail investors, right? So there are some real-world consequences.
It's interesting that you were just saying that to some extent, maybe unmasking Satoshi might not matter as much as some people think. And I was thinking as I read your book of an X-rated parable, which I will share with you, which is a man in Reno decides that it's time for his 15-year-old nephew to learn about sex. So he takes him to a brothel. And one of the women there volunteers to take this boy's virginity. And as she's leading this kid up the stairs, she looks back to him and says, "Remember, climbing the stairs is the best part." It's the mystery and anticipation that are more thrilling to us oftentimes than the revelation. And so I wonder if there is this potential that the revelation of Satoshi's real identity could just kind of be a letdown.
Absolutely. I mean, I thought about that a lot. I mean, I thought, what if it's just some random genius computer scientist, loner, who you've never heard of and lives in whereverville? And yeah, I mean, and that would be another case where I might hesitate before publishing that person's name because, you know, just the sort of consequence of turning the internet loose on a single low-profile individual who happened to have a good idea, I might hesitate to do that.
Yeah. Your book comes out, we're speaking, I think, 2 or 3 weeks before it comes out. So I'm hoping that some of your Satoshi obsession has waned just for the sake of your marriage. Have you gone cold turkey, or are you still dreaming about Satoshi? Are you still waking up at 2 a.m. thinking, oh my gosh, here's a string I never pulled on?
When I said that I've come around to thinking the NSA or CIA is a real possibility, I mean, that's something that I've come around to since completing the book. Like just because I do continue to think about it. And so that is a shift. I mean, I'm definitely less obsessed than I was. And part of the reason is because I felt like I wanted to do everything I humanly knew that could be done to attempt to solve this mystery. And I kind of felt I did it. But absolutely. I mean, if tomorrow some new person comes out of the woodwork, I will be fascinated by it. I mean, I'm curious to see what happens in the next 10 years with AI and the Satoshi mystery.
Yeah, right. There's all these different definitions of what is the threshold of artificial general intelligence or super intelligence. You know, is it, I think Microsoft says that AGI is the ability for AI to create a $100 billion business. I think maybe one definition is AI powerful enough to discover and unmask Satoshi Nakamoto.
I think that's a great idea. To replace the Turing test, it will be the Satoshi test.
If Satoshi came out of the woodwork tomorrow and he called you and you guys chatted and you were to ask him, Satoshi, how do you feel about what Bitcoin has become, 15 odd years after you created it? What do you think he'd say?
Without obviously being able to mind read, I think, and this is based on reporting and talking to a lot of people who came out of the same, sort of that cryptography community, I think he'd be disappointed. I think on the one hand, he would have to be impressed by what he had wrought, how huge Bitcoin has become, how it has birthed an entire asset class. There are something like 11,000 other cryptocurrencies according to Coinbase. And you have, the president of the United States talking about a Bitcoin strategic reserve. Whether or not that's a good idea, I just think Satoshi would have to be awed by the magnitude of what has happened to this. On the other hand, it's really moved very far away from what Bitcoin began as. I mean, Satoshi, for one thing, said that he thought there should only be one global blockchain, which is obviously different than 11,000 blockchains. He was concerned about network effects. The minute you begin to fragment and dilute people's interest, that's going to be a threat to Bitcoin. Bitcoin has not been able to become what it was originally intended to be, which was an electronic money. Mm-hmm. It has become a store of value like digital gold rather than a medium of exchange that people use for microtransactions or other use cases that Satoshi envisioned. And Satoshi was vigilant about reputational risks to Bitcoin. He cautioned the other early programmers not to promote it as an investment. He cautioned them not to stress its anonymity because that was overstated. And he also thought it might sound shady. Those were his words. And when people said, oh, this is great if WikiLeaks accepts Bitcoin, he said, no, that's not great. The controversy surrounding WikiLeaks, would sort of overwhelm this project. And so to see all of the hacks and scams and accidentally lost fortunes and people being held for ransom because of the Bitcoin they own, I mean, all of these things happening would be anathema to him, I think.
Well, I have one last question for you, Ben, which I feel obliged to ask. Are you Satoshi Nakamoto?
If I were, would I tell you?
Ben, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you today. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Caleb. This was fun.
Ben Wallace's new book, The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto, is out now. Pick up a copy. It is riveting. One last thing before I go. Rufus, you all know Rufus, he has this theory, it's actually really more of a fear, that one day Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency could replace the US dollar as the world's global reserve currency. And if that happens, he worries, the US will lose its place at the top of the world order. I asked Ben about this. Rufus, here's what he said.
You know, Hal Finney and other early programmers thought that was a very real possibility, and some of them hoped for it. I mean, I do think if it were to happen, it would be more likely to be one of the sort of OG ones like Bitcoin or Ethereum. I think it would be very hard now. And again, because of network effects, because of all of the coins that have come out that have been scams, I think it would be very hard for another cryptocurrency to gain the trust that Bitcoin has and the sort of solidity of like it's never been hacked. You know, I mean, the blockchain itself, exchanges have been hacked, but not Bitcoin.
Right.
And so I think were it to happen, it would be there.
But it seems like there are probably still a fair number of hurdles to that happening. One, you know, the energy consumption is still a problem. Volatility is obviously a problem. The deflationary element is potentially a problem. I think even just the fact that like there's a limit to how fast cryptocurrencies can process transactions, and it pales in comparison to traditional financial institutions. Like you just can't process transactions fast enough for it to be a global currency at this point.
Bitcoin is shockingly slow. It's literally 7 transactions per second.
Yeah. And I think I read that Visa can process 10,000 per second. So they've got their work cut out for us if they want to come for the US dollar.
Yeah.
Today's episode was written and edited by me, Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Jason Freeman. Our executive producer is Rufus Griscom. We think the team at the LinkedIn Podcast Network probably could have created Bitcoin because they're just so smart. We love working with them. I'm Caleb Bissinger. Oh, wait, I said that already. See you next week.
Hi, I'm Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn and co-host of Possible, a podcast where we explore building a brighter future with technology and map out how to get there. I recently spoke with Fei-Fei Li on human-centered AI, Bill Gates on AI's impact on climate change and health, and Shaun White on empathetic AI. Curious about what's possible? Listen wherever you get your podcasts.